The commencement of Order 66 was one of the most tragic events to transpire in the modern history of Star Wars lore, with nearly the entirety of the Jedi Order being executed in a matter of moments. Across the galaxy, the shadow of the Empire tightened its grip on the dying Republic by annihilating the Order that opposed them in one fell swoop, sowing distrust and misinformation into the legacy of the Jedi Order. As Palpatine did so, however, he used many of the closest allies that the Jedi had come to know and trust to execute this final order. While the loss of Jedi life was incredibly tragic, the fact that it came from the clones which had fought alongside them for years was even more so. So while this event is widely viewed through the lens of the Jedi, and what this meant for the Empire going forward, what were some of the unseen travesties that lie below the surface of Order 66? And what were some of the most dire effects on individuals other than the Jedi? And specifically, what did this mean for the clones in the long run? Well, stick with us today, students of the Force, and let's delve into the consequences that Order 66 had on the clones, both physically and mentally, as well as what their lives meant following after they were stripped down after the war and after the Clone Wars finally concluded, as well as discuss one of the darkest aspects of Order 66 that people rarely touch upon. Although the clone troopers were engineered in a lab and are, by all intents and purposes, artificial life forms, they have been known to show incredible humanity and prove that there's so much more than this over the course of the Clone Wars and other stories. Each clone, despite looking identical to his brethren, was their own unique individual that was unlike any other. They each had their own thoughts, desires, emotions, wishes, and fears, and they were, by all means, entirely human and just as unique as other life forms from across the galaxy. We've seen clones stray from their programming and wish to live lives in peace, and we've also seen clones develop intimate, personal bonds with one another, their Jedi generals, and the civilians of the Republic. The clones and the Jedi in particular built emotional bonds with one another that can only be forged under the heat of wartime, connecting on a personal level and coming to trust one another as individuals, not just generals and warriors. Faith built in times of chaos and desperation are widely known to be some of the deepest bonds between respective individuals, and being forced to trust each other in the heat of intergalactic war meant that many clones and Jedi formed ironclad relationships with one another that would echo into eternity. As the Jedi would come to learn, no two clones are ever the same. This made their perspective on Order 66 even more tragic, as they had no control over their actions and they were left to decimate the warriors who had fought alongside them for years, and do so without emotion, expression, or even a hint of remorse. When Order 66 commenced, many clones turned their attention away from the battle at hand in order to execute their respective Jedi on autopilot, and this meant that many of them were ultimately gunned down in battle by the Separatist army, this being a detail that not many ever talk about. While many clone battalions were not in the heat of immediate battle, many legions of clones were actively engaged in combat with the Separatists, pushing forward to cover more ground and give everything they had to the Clone Wars and the fight at hand. However, when Order 66 hijacked their minds, it meant that many clones turned their back on the battle entirely, leaving the Separatists to fire on targets who weren't fighting back at all. The clones didn't care about defending themselves at this moment, which meant that the droids mowed down hundreds of clones in some of the bloodiest Republic massacres that the Clone Wars had ever seen. It also means that they abandoned their friends, and there were no longer any covering fire to keep the droids at bay. This allowed the droids to utterly decimate clones across the galaxy, simply because the clones abandoned the fight for this crucial moment when many of them were in the heat of battle itself against the Separatist armies. The clones, like droids, ran on autopilot, unable to overcome their programming, and their emotional state completely died for these several crucial moments that would change galactic history. This means that not only were the clones slaughtered by the hundreds, but the survivors were left with the guilt of their actions and the consequences of something that they had no control or say over. Once they came to their senses, the weight of reality would have finally set in, and their emotional range finally returned to them in full. Not only did they kill their Jedi generals, their trusted loyal friend, and partners in battle, but they were directly responsible for the deaths of hundreds, if not potentially thousands of clones simply because they abandoned their post and their fight in the middle of combat. With this, in my opinion, being one of the most tragic aspects of all of Star Wars lore. We don't get to see much of the clones in the Imperial era, but we do get to see the mental toll that combat took on them on screen in a few different ways. Following the war, the need for the clones drastically diminished, and they were largely sent packing. Some clones were lucky though and continued to serve in the Imperial army, becoming the first iteration of the stormtroopers and putting their skills to use in the best ways that they knew how, by being soldiers. Most clones though were largely left to fend for themselves, finding a new way to make a living in a world that they knew ultimately nothing about. Even from the era of the Republic, battle was all the clones had ever known, and this was not a case where normal soldiers were conscripted from the populace at large. These clone troopers not only had no lives to go back to, but they had no fundamental understanding of how the larger galaxy operated at all, let alone in the age of a brand new empire. This left many clones lost, wandering throughout the cosmos in search of some way to make a living. We know that some groups, such as the Bad Batch, took on freelance bounty hunting work and worked with the criminal underworld, which opens the doorway to assume that many clones took on work as mercenaries or private contractors for the years to come. We know that Rex lives in relative isolation with just a few clone comrades, and throughout the course of the Rebel series, we see how the events of the war haunted him even after being freed from the effects of Order 66, as well as his inhibitor chip by Ahsoka during the events of the final season of the Clone Wars. The social and psychological trauma that the clones endured left them utterly alone, seeing as they had no other outlet, no purpose aside from fighting a war that was now over. These traumas left the clones to suffer largely in silence as the world around them rejected them, deemed them as irrelevant and outdated, and the most trusted allies that the clones likely could have turned to in such a time of need had been slaughtered by their own hands. And this, my friends, I believe is just as tragic as the deaths of the Jedi during Order 66, as not only did it mark the deaths of the Jedi, but also the clones that served by their side, abandoned in the galaxy that would follow, left to die and rot away, as we see unfortunately during the events of Obi-Wan Kenobi. But anyway, students of the Force, what did you think of the toll that Order 66 took on the clone troopers? What other struggles do you think they had to endure, and how do you think the clones were able to cope with these problems in the new empire? As always, my friends, thank you guys so much for watching the channel. May the Force be with you, and I hope that you have a great day.